Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, our focus is Ukraine. As peace talks continue between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul, we take a look at the chances of any kind of a breakthrough. Well, those talks come after a weekend which saw Ukrainian forces launch a huge drone attack on military bases deep inside Russia. We ask, how did Ukraine pull off Operation Spider's Web? Meanwhile, the British Prime Minister unveils a new defence review stating the country is moving to a war-fighting readiness mode. More on that. Well, let's get more details on that drone attack deep inside Russian territory. We can speak now to Yuriy Sak, who's an advisor to Ukraine's Ministry of Strategic Industries and who was formerly at the Ukrainian Ministry of Defence. Mr. Sak, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Let's start by talking to you about Operation Spider's Web. I mean, a highly sophisticated operation. Drones hidden under the roofs on trucks. The roof was remotely opened and then the drones were released. What's your understanding of how this was carried out?
Good afternoon, Tom. So this was a unique operation that was supervised personally by our president. And of course, there was very limited number of people who were privy to the information because this operation was being prepared for a year and a half. It was carried out 1,000 miles away from Ukraine, and it involved smuggling of certain FPV drones into the Russian territory. And these trucks, they were then assembled inside Russia. One of the locations was 4,500 kilometers away from Ukrainian border. So this was a very complex operation, and this is why it was kept under very strict confidence.
Yeah, I mean, it was an amazing operation in that there were no casualties that we're aware of, and yet 41 aircraft were hit, doing enormous damage to the Russian Air Force, billions of dollars worth of damage, and as you say, the longest range assault of the war. So what do you think the significance of this attack is and will be?
Well, it's a hugely significant attack because it demonstrates to our allies, again, that Ukraine is capable of sudden, very well prepared and immaculately executed operations in the new type of modern warfare. So that's point number one. Point number two, it of course demonstrates to the world that Russia is a paper tiger, which is what we've been saying all along, because if we were able to take out their strategic bombers, the ones that constitute the so-called part of their nuclear triad, if we were able to take out their strategic bombers with drones with $500, $600, I mean, that again exposes Russia's weaknesses. And overall, in the global dynamics of how this war is now viewed, even by our partners, of course, it demonstrates that Ukraine has those cards that have been discussed so often recently.
Yeah, and these are the bombers, the Tu-22M bombers at that airbase in Belaya in Siberia that have been used to strike inside Ukraine. And I'm just wondering whether that in turn has triggered a reaction in Ukraine. I mean, is there a sense of justice or revenge in all of this?
Well, the first reaction that we always have in Ukraine when our armed forces or special forces succeed, and in particular on this occasion, is a sense of relief, because we all know here in Ukraine that those aircraft, they were used on a daily basis to launch cruise missiles on our country, which would, these missiles would land on peaceful cities and kill people. So the first is sense of relief. For us, it's about survival. It's not about so much revenge or vengeance, right? But at the same time, of course, we are collectively very proud of our special forces, because what has happened, this spiderweb operation, it will go down in the textbooks for all special forces around the world. And it's unique. It's not been done before, and I think it's surpassed the expectations of even the skeptics.
And given what we were saying about this being the longest range assault of the war so far carried out by Ukraine, striking the Belaya Air Force Base in Siberia, do you think that's got some sort of a psychological dimension to it in terms of the impact seen from the Russian side?
Well, we have seen already panic and hysteria in Russian social media, in Russian propaganda TV channels. They have been all taken aback by what has happened. They are at a loss as to who to criticize, who is to blame. One Russian propaganda TV channel was calling today to execute the young soldiers who failed to detect those trucks. There are, as we're seeing, there are lines of trucks because every truck now in Russia is being, or they have to check it. And of course, it spreads the sense of paranoia that, if those 4 trucks were able to do yesterday what they did, then similar trucks could be, all over Russia. And, Russians are beginning to feel this war, which they brought upon us. They're beginning to feel it at home. And of course, it's only just and fair.
But in terms of how Russia responds, which is what I want to get on to talking about with you now, we did have overnight the reports of 472 Russian drone strikes and 7 missile strikes or attacks overnight on Ukraine. That's a record, I believe, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began. Do you think we are now entering a sort of fairly inevitable escalatory phase of the war?
It's very difficult to say, but of course, Ukrainian authorities are warning Ukrainian citizens that they have to be now extra careful and vigilant when the air raid sirens ring out, because Russia is a deranged terrorist state. They've been launching these massive missile and drone attacks even before yesterday's spiderweb operation. And of course, they will probably be now looking for a way to kind of present to their own people some form of response. And considering that, I will repeat, this is a deranged terrorist state, the Ukrainian people are warned that if you hear an air raid siren, make sure you're in a bomb shelter, take your kids to the bomb shelter, and just seek cover and safety.
In terms of where we go to from here, do you think we could be entering, a new phase in the war? Do you think we might be entering a more unpredictable phase in this war?
Well, look, we are building up our own Ukrainian defense industry base. We are producing, by the thousands, we are producing deep strike drones. All the targets, and you rightly mentioned that no civilians, for example, were hit yesterday. So the targets that we have are always military, which is unlike the Russians who strike our civilian objects. And, we hope that our successes, like the one yesterday, coupled with diplomatic efforts of Ukraine and our partners, will result in Russia realizing finally that this is an unwinnable war for them, and they have to sit down at that negotiating table and start talking, meaningfully about reaching peace and ceasefire and ending this war. But for now, everybody's in Ukraine, at least, very skeptical, because Russians are not showing any signs that they want peace.
Yeah, you mentioned those talks, and I'd like to talk about them in a bit more detail in just a moment. But just with regards to the operation that was carried out on Sunday, what sort of a message do you think that operation sends out, coming as it did on the eve of the discussions in Istanbul?
Well, we've seen that, the members of the Russian delegation who entered today the negotiating room, they were not so arrogant and bolshy as they were the last time. So, of course, we came to this negotiating table with a strong negotiating hand, and it was actually palpable in the air, because that's how negotiations work. You have to have a strong position.
Yeah, it looks like something has come out of those talks. Sort of fairly scant details for now, but it would appear a further an elaboration of the POW exchange. What else do you think is achievable at those talks in Istanbul?
Well, at this stage, I don't think. I mean, that should be regarded as a very good outcome, because all the other issues, like Russians are refusing to agree to a ceasefire. They are refusing to engage meaningfully in the discussion even of the ceasefire. So, we are very transparent and honest. Our position has been aligned with the position of the European partners, with the United States of America. And, our position is very clear. Let's start the ceasefire unconditionally on land, on sea, in the air, and then we can start talking peace. Russians, it's falling on deaf ears when it comes to Russians. So we'll have to just keep, increasing the pressure both on the battlefield inside Russia and on the international economic arena. More sanctions. Making it more difficult for Russia to sell their oil, their gas, their energy resources, so that they cannot replenish their war machinery.
And you mentioned the United States. President Trump has said that the US could withdraw from its role as mediator if no progress is made. I mean, were the United States to sort of walk away from the negotiations process and leave you and the Russians to it, who would fare worse, do you think, in that scenario?
Well, look, we don't want to speculate, of course, and we believe that everything that Donald Trump is saying is part of his art of the deal. So, but I think, and we hope that deep inside he understands very well that supporting Ukraine and making sure that this war ends with a just peace is in the interests of the United States of America, because it's not a faraway war in a remote country that has no consequence for the global order. It's the epicenter of the future world order. So what happens in Ukraine will reverberate across the globe. And that's not something that it just happens so. We're in the epicenter of the tectonic transformation of the world global order. And we hope that the US will, for this reason, continue to be our partner, our strategic partner. They will continue supporting us. And if they have to, if they have to pronounce certain things as part of the art of the deal to move the process forward, then so be it. We are adults, so we can live with that.
Okay. Now, are you seeing anything new in terms of the approach to bringing about an end to this war that perhaps gives you a little optimism you might not have had a couple of months ago?
Well, yes, we're seeing that Donald Trump actually personally is beginning to be more frustrated with what's happening, because he's probably beginning to realize what we knew all along. Russians cannot be trusted. Russians have no interest in peace. Russians want to destroy Ukraine, to entirely, make Ukraine disappear from the map. So we know this, and we were honestly telling this to our American partners and to Donald Trump and his team. But of course, they were harboring this hope that Russians could be talked some sense into them. I think they're beginning to see, the reality as it is, and that reality is pretty grim, and that's why Donald Trump begins to be frustrated. We hope that frustration translates into action, more support for Ukraine, more sanctions on Russia, more pressure, because that will be in line with what he himself said: peace through force. I mean, that's his formula, and I think about time it's implemented.
And just lastly, I mean, we are being told that Russia has captured another village in the northern Ukrainian province of Sumy, the region of Sumy, I should say. What's your understanding of the overall situation on the battlefield right now?
They're making some incremental advances, paying a staggering price for them in terms of manpower and equipment. But again, they're capturing one obscure village in Ukraine. We have just destroyed 1/3 of their nuclear triad, the aerial component. So it's an asymmetric warfare. It's a smart war that we are fighting. So we fall back where necessary to other defense positions. And actually, we've had some calculations. At this rate, if Russians were to conquer Ukraine, if at this rate, it will take them more than 100 years, actually, because I will repeat, these gains, in territorial gains, they're real, but they're very, very small. And But we're seeing again in the intensification of their activities on the front lines, and it's probably going to get worse in the coming months.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for sharing that with us.
Thank you, Tom.
Yuriy Sak, advisor to Ukraine's Ministry of Strategic Industries. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Meanwhile, in the context of these hostilities and the perceived threat from Russia, the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer says his country is going to expand its nuclear-powered attack submarine fleet and shift the purpose of its armed forces to a state of, quote, warfighting readiness. Well, the changes are part of a defence review that is designed to prepare the country to fight a modern war and counter, as we said, the threat from Russia.
We are moving to warfighting readiness as the central purpose of our armed forces. When we are being directly threatened by states with advanced military forces, the most effective way to deter them is to be ready. And frankly, to show them that we're ready, to deliver peace through strength.
Well, let's get more now. We can cross to Sir Michael Fallon, a former UK Defence Secretary who joins us from the UK. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again here on Arabiya News, Sir Michael. I just want to start, before I start talking to you about what the British Prime Minister has announced by way of this defence review, I'd like to ask for your reaction to that Ukrainian military Operation Spider's Web, the most damaging Ukrainian drone attack of the war so far. What were your thoughts when you heard about it?
It looks a stunning achievement by Ukraine, and extremely useful. It'll save lives if it stops these long-range bombers attacking and destroying civilian apartments and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. Then the daring of the Ukrainian forces will really have paid off. And I hope Russia takes the right lesson from this, stops the strikes on Ukraine, and gets down to some serious peace talks.
Yeah, there were no casualties from Operation Spider's Web that we know of, and yet 41 planes were hit, billions of dollars of damage done to the Russian Air Force. Do you think there's a psychological dimension to this as well? And do you think there will be some sort of an impact on the Russian population and perhaps on morale as a result?
Well, certainly, I think the Russian population will be wondering how these explosions how these bombs got through to these airfields, which are really quite remote from the front line in Ukraine. So certainly, they will feel less safe as a result. But I hope they will also understand that, these planes that have been destroyed were destroying civilian lives and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine.
Let's turn our attention to what's been happening in the United Kingdom, because we've heard Sir Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, talking about how Britain must be battle ready. Let me start by asking you about that. I mean, what does he mean when he says Britain must be battle ready?
Well, the Defence Review that's been published today recognises quite rightly that the main threat to the United Kingdom is now Russia. It's very clear about that. So what Russia has done in invading Crimea and Ukraine, and before that Georgia, the attacks on our businesses, our hospitals through cyber, the menacing of our underwater cables, the incursions into near our airspace. There's no doubt now that Russia poses a threat to us here in the United Kingdom, as well as to the whole eastern frontier of NATO. And what the Prime Minister wants to do now is to wake people up to that. That means accelerating the modernisation of our defences, and it means investing in some of the long-term military equipment that we need. You've seen the announcement now about investing in new submarines, investing in more missiles.
Do you think the desire of the British Prime Minister as well is that the United States will pay attention to what the UK, a close and traditional ally of America, is doing here, especially when you single out Russia as being the biggest threat that the UK currently faces right now?
Well, certainly, what Trump is doing in America is forcing all the European members of NATO to rethink and increase the level of their defence spending. And there's a danger here for the Prime Minister, because he hasn't yet put a date on us getting to 3% of our gross domestic product, whereas some of the Baltic states, Poland, other countries have actually gone beyond that. And America itself, of course, spends well above 3%. So there's a slight danger that when Trump gets here to the NATO summit at the end of this month, Britain actually is slightly lagging the others. But the other job I think Britain has got to do, poised between Europe and the United States, is to try and convince the United States that actually all these conflicts, whether it's Indo-Pacific, the Middle East, or what Russia is doing in Ukraine, they're all linked together. And that Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China are now joining up to undermine the West and to disrupt the democracies. And really, the more we can be doing here to help Ukraine win their struggle helps the Americans, takes the load off them and helps them face up to the military growth in China.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that point you made about defence spend as a percentage of GDP. And as we've been saying, the British Prime Minister says the UK is committed to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence by 2027, with the ambition, he says, of hitting 3% by 2034. I mean, that's a pretty long way off. And just to pick up on something that someone I'm sure you know has been saying, Lord Dannatt on Times Radio quoted as saying, that's a bit like saying in 1938 to Adolf Hitler, please don't attack us until 1946, because we're not quite ready there. I mean, do you agree with Lord Dannatt that the British government really needs to take this up a couple of gears?
Yes, I do. And, I'm very pleased they've adopted 2.5%. That was important. But it's too far away, I think, to get to 3%, particularly when other allies in Europe are spending more. And, we need to set a firmer target. And, our industry needs that as well. They need to be able to plan ahead, to start investing in the new equipment that our armed forces need. And they need to start doing that now. So it's, some of these programs are very long-term programs, and we need to make a start. And saying we've got the ambition really, isn't good enough. As Richard Dannatt said, ambition doesn't deter anybody. What does deter Russia in the end is standing up to them.
OK, so we're saying this ambition is not quite ambitious enough. You mentioned spend. There's another dimension to this, which is, of course, people. I mean, does there need to be a significant increase in recruitment in the ranks of the British military? Have they got enough manpower?
No, they haven't at the moment. Most of the army is under-recruited, and there's a serious recruitment crisis in the Royal Navy. People aren't coming forward to serve. And we need to address that. It means looking at the terms, the pay, the conditions. There's some more money going into military housing, which I welcome. But we've also, I think, got to work to bridge this gap between our civic society that has been very well protected and comfortable, if you like, since the end of the Second World War, and our military. Now, our military have gone off to Afghanistan, they've gone to Iraq, they've gone off to fight wars inside these big coalitions. But that's got detached, I think, from us back at home. And we've got to re-establish that link and educate, I think, people all over again, especially young people, that the military really is part of us. And all of us have an obligation, to be part of the resilience that we now want to see.
Yeah, just in terms of the language that was used by Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, I mean, he talked about war readiness. I mean, that's quite a departure from talking about deterrence, isn't it? And one of the things that was said during the course of the weekend, Germany's top defence official, General Carsten Brewer, warns of a possible Russian attack on a NATO state within the next 4 years. I mean, do you share that assessment that such an attack could be as close in time as that?
Yes, I do. And if you go to the frontline states, if you go to Romania, where I was last week, if you go to the Baltic states or Poland and you get off the plane, people say to you, welcome to the front line, because they see Russian troops massing on their border. They have Russian aircraft buzzing their aerospace overhead. And we've had direct attacks here in Britain. We had an attack in a cathedral city in Salisbury. But more than that, recently, we've had attacks on our businesses. We've had attacks on our health service, cyber attacks. Now, there's no doubt at all now that, Russia is an adversary. And we have to shake ourselves, I think, out of some complacency and remind everybody that this is a very direct threat, not just to Ukraine that's suffering, not just to Moldova or the Baltic states, but a very direct threat to us here in Western Europe and to the United Kingdom.
Do you think, what are we, 10 years almost on from Brexit? Do you think a common threat and a common fear of conflicts on the European continent, with Russia behind it, as you say, do you think that somehow brought Britain closer to its European neighbours across the Channel?
Yes, I do, and so it should. This is our continent, and you can't keep relying, for example, on the Americans to come and defend us. The Second World War ended 80 years ago, and we still depend on thousands of American troops. We have to step up. And there are half a dozen members of NATO who nowhere near spending the 2% at the moment, all on the western side of Europe. So Britain needs to be part of that. We should be one of the leading militaries in Europe, and we should be playing our part. And, we have that particular alliance with the United States. We have a global role as well, protecting our sea routes. We have a carrier heading for the Indo-Pacific at the moment. So it really falls on us to step up. And I think we've got to put some of the Brexit battles and the Brexit language behind us. This is our continent. And as we've had to do before, we have to step up and help defend it.
But do you not worry, Sir Michael, that all of this expenditure on military hardware, on defence, risks somehow triggering a cycle of militarisation across Europe? And does that bring with it associated risks?
No, the European countries were spending much more on defence. As we came to the end of the Cold War, we were spending more than we're spending today at the very start of this century. No, I think we've got ourselves into a state of some complacency that the threat isn't really here and that we don't need to get involved in this stuff. And Richard Dannett is right. We have shrunk our armed forces successively under different governments to the point where we do need to rebuild. Now, we started that a few years ago, but we certainly need to rebuild more, Army, Navy and Air Force. And we need to take the public along with us. We need to explain why we're doing this, that what is happening in Ukraine is part of what we are there to deal with, which is to defend the freedoms and democracy that we have here and to help other democracies that are under threat.
Yeah, you mentioned public opinion. There's also the public purse. There will be people asking, can the United Kingdom afford to spend so very much more on its defence? What would be your answer to that?
Well, defence just has to come first. I'm quite sure Ukraine signed up to net zero. I'm sure they'd love to be spending money on getting towards net zero. They can't do any of that stuff when they've been invaded and they're fighting Russia. So these other things, dealing with child poverty, overseas aid, getting to net zero, these are all desirable things. But the very first thing you've got to do is to defend your country and make sure you're not threatened in the way that Ukraine has been threatened.
And just lastly, we're going to wrap it up right after this question, but I just want to ask you lastly where you see things heading to from here. There have been talks taking place in Istanbul. It appears some new POW exchange has come out of that, and there'll be another round, we're being told, in June. Are you seeing any signs that perhaps there could be a way out of this that's not a military way out of this? Are you hopeful that those talks in Istanbul could yield some results?
Well, reasonably hopeful. I always thought this, couldn't be done in a day or a week or whatever President Trump said. It took a long time to end the Korean War or the Vietnam War. These things do take a long time to put together again. And obviously the first step ought to be some kind of ceasefire. But, at the moment, the President of America wants to see some sort of agreement. And I should think in the end, the Russians do want some sort of agreement. They're not winning this war. They're not losing it. They're not being pushed out of Ukraine, but they're not getting very much further. And Ukraine has demonstrated again at the weekend that it's absolutely determined to resist to the end. And, until there is a ceasefire, while civilians keep being killed in Ukraine, the West ought to keep stepping up and keep giving Ukraine the equipment it needs to help protect its citizens.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Always a pleasure speaking to you. Sir Michael Fallon, former UK Defence Secretary, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, as we've been hearing, Ukraine's large-scale drone attack destroyed some 40 Russian aircraft. Well, the strike took place as Moscow simultaneously pounded Ukraine with missiles and drones. And just hours before, a new round of direct peace talks were held in Istanbul. Well, let's get more analysis on all of that. We can speak to Ambassador Matthew Bryza, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia, who joins us now from Baku. Ambassador, great to have you with us once again here on Arabiya English. One of the things I'd like to start by talking to you about is a warning that came from Germany's top defense official, General Carsten Breuer, who warned of a possible Russian attack within 4 years. And he was talking about NATO countries. I was wondering how seriously you think NATO and the member states should take that sort of a timeline.
Yeah, thank you, Tom, for having me with you and for such a thoughtful question. All throughout NATO Europe, the similar predictions or assessments are being talked about. And I used to run a military or a Ministry of Defense think tank in Estonia, and we had our annual conference a couple of weeks ago, and there were several chiefs of defense and four-star generals and ministers of defense who unanimously were saying within 5 years, Russia will have the capability to attack European members of NATO. Now, that's not the same thing as an intention. That's a capability, which leads to then Europe wanting to scale up its defense capacity as quickly as possible. So capability, yeah, intention, that remains to be seen.
One of the other things that General Breuer said is that the threat level is the most severe he's seen in his 40 years of service. Now, I don't know if you have 40 years of service. I don't expect you do. But do you agree with the essence of what he says? And do you think Washington views it in the same way that he does?
I think yes and no. So, yes, I think the threat level is as high as it has ever been when it comes to Europe. I mean, there's, the first full-scale war on European territory since World War II. It's happening right now. And President Putin has shown his willingness to challenge at the margins NATO territory. There are some weapons that have landed in Romania and in Poland, maybe by mistake. And he conducted operations in Ukraine, so in Donetsk and in Crimea back in 2014, that could be replicated in the Baltic states, meaning military operations that are ambiguously Russian until Putin says, yes, these were Russian operations, which then fall beneath the threshold of a response under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, whereby all NATO allies have to come to the aid of any NATO ally that's under threat. I think the reason why this threat level is so high from Russia is precisely because of Washington not really appreciating that there is this level of threat, and President Putin thinking that he can either wear out President Trump politically, tire him out, or manipulate President Trump into allowing Russia not to have to fear a U.S. retaliation for a Russian strike.
Okay, but Mr. Trump might be saying, what's the evidence to suggest that Russia is indeed planning an attack within that time frame? I mean, are there any credible indicators, any credible intelligence that such an attack could be in the offing?
Well, I don't know of any, but when ministers of defense of NATO member states are issuing such public warnings, they're not doing it out of the clear blue sky. There was significant intelligence before Putin's second invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 from the United States saying that the buildup that he was undergoing on Russia's border with Ukraine also was accompanied by the intention to attack Ukraine. And at that time, those warnings of the Biden administration were largely ignored by the U.S.'s NATO allies and by the Ukrainian government itself, I should add. So now European leaders and military leaders, maybe you can say they're being more careful or they're being prudent, but whether or not they have specific intelligence of Russia's intention to invade NATO territory, I don't know. But what there clearly is a growing Russian capability to do so.
Okay, what about the European capability and the NATO capability? Do you think Europe and the NATO member states can scale up their defense readiness in that 4-year window that was set out by the German general?
Well, put it this way, the chief of defense of Estonia at this conference, so this was 2 weeks ago, said, yeah, Europe can scale up. quickly enough. The question is, are we thinking about it the right way? Are Europeans ready to fight and ready to fight to win? And I think that political question remains unanswered in Europe, with a lot of European NATO members, Hungary, for example, not willing to engage in the sort of scaling up and deterrence of Russia. But the capabilities that Europe needs to scale up quickly are increasingly things that it simply doesn't have at all, like airlift capacity, which the United States has provided, significant air defense and space-based capabilities for intelligence purposes to be able to target and therefore deter Russian forces. And what Europe also lacks, and it's unclear if it'll be able to develop these capabilities within 5 years, is the ability to strike deeply into Russian territory like Ukraine just did by destroying, as you said, Tom, up to 1/3 of Russia's strategic bomber force with this drone attack deep inside Russia.
Yeah, I want to ask you a bit more about that in just a moment. But I want to ask you before that, what's the point of this German general issuing a warning like the one he issued? Because doesn't it risk escalating tensions even further than they'd go to otherwise? And doesn't everything at that point become something of a self-fulfilling prophecy?
The answer to your question would be yes, if President Putin was not behaving the way that he is. He has threatened the use of nuclear weapons. He has threatened nuclear weapons and exercised the use of nuclear weapons on European, now NATO member states. He did that in Sweden a few years ago, against Sweden. So Putin he's suggesting he's willing to use force, and that's against NATO member states. And if that's the signal being sent, if there is not a clear response by NATO that if you do this, Mr. President, we will respond and we will defeat you, and therefore there's no point in your threatening us with military force, then there wouldn't be a deterrent. So no, it's very important when President Putin is sending these belligerent signals and has invaded Ukraine and has vowed to eliminate it as a viable state, that in my opinion, that NATO is being very clear in response that if you touch NATO territory, your military will be destroyed. So don't even think about it. And therefore, de-escalate. That's how de-escalation works diplomatically.
Let's talk about Operation Spider's Web for a moment. Russia calling it a very serious blow. You just mentioned yourself as well, a reminder that a large number of Russian aircraft, some serious Russian military hardware was destroyed. What do you see the consequences of something like that as being?
Well, number one, Russia will respond against Ukraine, but it already is. It's launched its biggest aerial bombardments of Ukraine, of civilian targets, by the way, during the last week since the war began, or since the full-scale invasion began. So, but Russia, President Putin will feel compelled to lash out. He'll continue attacking cities and schools and apartment buildings and energy infrastructure in Ukraine. But on the other hand, I think that this sort of creative, forceful, impactful, even maybe devastating in the short term attack by Ukraine is the sort of thing that garners respect, yes, anger from President Putin, but also respect, and a sense that Russia now will really maybe have to negotiate in good faith and think about ending the war, because until now, as President Trump has suggested, it seems that President Putin has not been serious about negotiating an end to the war. He's refused the U.S. proposal for an unconditional 30-day ceasefire and has instead decided to continue bombarding Ukrainian cities. So when Ukraine pulls off a really spectacular attack like this one, it must give President Putin pause and have him think, wow, maybe continuing this war is not a great idea for me or for Russia.
Right, so an impact on the psychology of Russian people, the Russian army, the Russian leadership, the fact that Ukraine was able to strike so deeply into Russian territory. I mean, it does slightly undermine that aura of Russian military might, doesn't it?
Oh, it totally does. And by the way, I mean, Max Boot, he's a brilliant friend of mine and a columnist in the Washington Post. He wrote a column today saying, this also has an impact on warfare globally, because, up until now, the United States, NATO allies, everybody has thought if you put a big old steel fence with, guard posts around an airfield and you have air defense, missiles, et cetera, the airfield is protected. Ukraine has just shown that, no, that's not the case at all. And maybe these big lumbering strategic bombers are not so useful in this era of hyper adaptable and creative drone warfare.
Now, Ambassador Bryza, you're usually based in Istanbul, I gather, which is, of course, where the latest round of talks has been taking place, direct talks between delegations from Russia and Ukraine. Today's round was pretty short, about an hour, and I'm assuming, I don't know what you think, and clearly this is highly speculative, but I mean, what sort of impact do you think Operation Spider's Web would have had on the overall mood and feeling at those talks?
Yeah, I happen to be in Baku for an energy conference, but I'm watching the events back home, if you will, in Istanbul closely. And as I was alluding to a moment ago, I think the Ukrainian attacks were timed to have a positive impact on the Russian delegation. Russia has sent every signal it wasn't taking these negotiations seriously, whereas Ukraine has sent its defense minister to the talks. Russia has sent the former culture minister. There's no decision level member of the Russian delegation, and even though the two parties in their last round of talks in May agreed they would submit draft plans for a way forward before this meeting, Russia refused to do so while Ukraine did submit such a plan. So Russia was indicating, we're not going to negotiate in good faith. We're not taking these talks seriously. Okay, President Donald Trump wants us at least to run through the motions. Okay, we'll do it, but we hope he's going to put pressure back on Zelensky and eventually, run out of interest and withdraw from the mediation effort, as Vice President J.D. Vance warned the U.S. might do a couple of weeks ago. So now I think President Putin's delegation will start negotiating more seriously, or at least possibly considering more serious negotiations. So I actually think this will be helpful for the talks.
Okay, and something that did come out of it is a further prisoners swap, focusing on the most severely injured prisoners on both sides. I mean, is that meaningful? Is that a meaningful step?
It is. It's certainly meaningful for those injured soldiers and their families, and thank God that this happened. So it's very meaningful, but it's. I think we're deluding ourselves if we expect a sustained ceasefire anytime soon. President Putin has not achieved any of the goals he's articulated, his strategic goals, which is essentially regime change in Kyiv, ending the military capabilities of Ukraine, and NATO pulling back its political and military enlargement since the end of the Cold War. That is not going to happen. So President Putin needs to explain why nearly, 750,000 or more Russian soldiers have been killed or injured. For what purpose? For what goals being achieved? So President Putin feels compelled to keep fighting to try to achieve more and more territory taken from Ukraine. So eventually he can say, okay, it was worth it. But he's not at that point yet, so he has to keep on fighting. So what Ukraine is demanding is that besides prisoner swaps and a 30-day unconditional ceasefire, that the children who were abducted and kidnapped by Russia be returned to Ukraine. That would be a really important step as well, even though that wouldn't mark the end of the war.
Right, and all the while, President Zelensky saying, and we've alluded to this already, there must be a new, quote, level of pressure that includes sanctions on Russia. And I think it sounds as though he's making that appeal to Washington. I mean, is that appeal likely to be taken into consideration, or is it likely to fall on deaf ears?
Well, it has been taken into consideration when President Trump has warned several weeks ago that he feels that President Putin may just be tapping him along, he said, and then President Trump threatened to impose even more crippling sanctions on Russia if President Putin continues to refuse to negotiate in good faith. But having said that, clearly, President Trump doesn't want to take that step. Clearly, he wants to find a way to restructure international politics in sort of a concert like the 1815 concert of Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, when Europe's great powers and the autocracies decided the near-term security and political future of Europe. President Trump likes that way of conducting diplomacy. So he wants to work with the strong, tough leaders like President Putin, I think like Xi Jinping as well, and others, and maybe get a deal in Iran or with Iran.
And just lastly, I mean, when President Trump says to both sides, the Russians and the Ukrainians, if you don't sort this out and strike a deal at some point quite soon, we're going to walk away and leave you to it. I mean, do you think he's serious? And if he is, which side do you think would fare worse as a result?
I do think he's serious, and I think Ukraine would by far suffer the worst of it, because without U.S. support, it's much more difficult for Ukraine to keep up this fight, though it will keep it up for a long time. But it is exactly what Vladimir Putin wants, right? Putin's strategy had been hope for President Trump to be reelected and for President Trump to cut U.S. military assistance to Ukraine. That has happened. Now what Putin wants is for the U.S. mediation to end. If the U.S. mediation ends, if Trump loses interest and stops providing military assistance to Ukraine, then Putin's hands are untied. He doesn't have to worry about these additional sanctions from the U.S. or alienating his friend, Donald Trump. And so the best thing for Putin right now is for the U.S. to walk away from the process. And that's probably the worst thing for Ukraine to have happen.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to share that with us. Ambassador Matthew Bryza, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Tom. Pleasure.
Well, let's get more now from William Alberque, who is a former director of NATO's Arms Control, Disarmament and Weapons of Mass Destruction Non-Proliferation Centre, now a senior adjunct fellow at the Pacific Forum. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again here on Arabiya English, sir. I just want to start by asking you about Operation Spider's Web. According to reports, drones were hidden inside the roofs of wooden sheds, and those shed roofs were then opened by remote control. I mean, have you ever heard anything like that?
Oh, no, I've never seen an attack like this ever. It's one of the most audacious and extensive military operations carried out by clandestine services. It also included trucks that apparently the top would lift off remotely, and 36 drones would be able to fly out of the back of the truck as well. So truly an extraordinary attack.
And how significant of a setback, based on what we know at this stage, would you say this attack was for Moscow?
Honestly, it's one of the most humiliating days for any air force in the world. We're talking about claims of up to 41 strategic aircraft eliminated. Yeah, this is the greatest one-day loss for aircraft of a strategic nature outside of, I would say, World War II.
And in terms of how Washington views this, and you know, President Trump and President Zelensky have had a few differences, and that was plain for everyone to see in the Oval Office back in late February. But I think it's fair to say, I mean, without sort of simplifying things too much, that President Trump does tend to side with the stronger side. And I'm wondering whether this sort of audacious, to use your words, attack gives President Zelensky that lift to make him the slightly stronger party at this particular juncture of the war. I mean, could there be anything in that that perhaps means that support for President Zelensky from Washington is more forthcoming than it was previously?
I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, first we have to say that according to Zelensky, he started planning this mission 18 months ago. So, you know, I think a direct correlation between things that are happening right now and the planning is a little bit hard to justify. But certainly in the context of negotiations where Ukraine is trying to get more leverage against Putin himself, first of all, but also, as you point out, to demonstrate to President Trump that Ukraine is strong and powerful at a time when Trump is seemingly a little bit disappointed in Putin's unwillingness to engage seriously in negotiations. The timing just could not have been better for Ukraine. And I think you're absolutely correct. I think there's a lot to be said for the idea that President Trump is going to be looking at Ukraine as a strong party to this conflict, and maybe, you know, that could shift some of his views.
Clearly a boost for Ukrainian morale, and clearly a massive blow for Russia, and a psychological dimension to all of this is that Ukraine is capable of striking what everyone had believed to be one of the mightiest armies in the world deep inside their own territory, using fairly unsophisticated but ingenious weaponry here. But I'd like to ask you about another impact beyond the psychological impact, which is there a real risk of a massive escalation at this point?
You know, it's really interesting because this comes right after Russia did one of the largest attacks that it's unleashed on Ukraine in terms of missiles and drones striking at civilian and military targets across Ukraine. It's hard to know what Russia would do to escalate. I still believe that Russia does not believe, Putin himself knows that the risk of going nuclear could be that he would lose Chinese support, he would lose Indian support. The economy would really, really suffer tremendously and the direct military support from China could disappear. But also, the fact that the UK and France and even the United States might intervene in the conflict. So it's hard to see what he could do that would be more horrible than what he's already done to Ukraine. I don't think he has a lot of escalation room left. And honestly, I think the costs and the fact that, just as you said, that this has hit Russia so deep inside Russian territory, it's really something deep in their minds that their country is so big that they can hide if they really need to from this conflict. And the fact that Ukraine has hit them so many places across Russia really steals that idea away that Putin has some kind of sanctuary somewhere and might actually help bring him to the table.
So all of that being the case, why do you think people like Germany's General Brewer, who I believe is the most powerful military man in Germany, is issuing warnings along the lines of, an attack on NATO and on European nations could be 4 years away from now? Where do you think he's coming from?
I think he's coming from the idea that Russia has now oriented its entire economy towards warfare, towards building military capabilities. And the fear really is that as soon as this war stops, Russia will begin rearming. And that if Russia feels like it has lost this war, that it might even be more aggressive in the future. And I think he's trying to send a signal out to the other allies that no matter what happens in the coming days or weeks, we do have to prepare ourselves for the potential for longer-term conflict with Russia, that basically the Russia problem's not going away anytime soon. So in that respect, I think it's a wise thing to start thinking about. This isn't something that's going to go away even with the cessation of combat in Ukraine. In fact, it could become a more acute problem in the future.
And yeah, I mean, that sort of a warning comes at roughly the same sort of time the British Prime Minister, and we've been talking about it before we crossed to you with our other guests, the British Prime Minister unveiling a massive review of defence spending in the UK. I mean, this Ukraine chapter seems to have been a massive wake-up call to a lot of countries in Europe. Do you think they're stepping up to the plate in an adequate fashion?
I would say that it's been remarkable. Since 2014, the alarm has been going off very stridently. You go back to the Russian war on Georgia in 2008. This has been a problem that has been long ignored by the European allies. And so I do think they are reacting as best as they possibly can. 2022 was such a shock to the system for so many countries that really wanted to believe that Russia would never do something like this. And now we start seeing real capabilities starting to develop in Europe. The twin of this shock being the fears that the United States might disengage. It's really turbocharged thinking about the security of Europe. As you mentioned, the UK announcement, which also includes some background conversations about new developments on their nuclear thinking as well. I think we're going to see some big, big changes in the European defense environment caused by the war, caused by Trump and fear of detachment, that is really going to transform the way European acts as a military and security power in the future.
Do you think there are some vulnerabilities in Europe that Russia might seek to exploit during the next few years?
We've already seen it. We've already seen Russian saboteurs, assassinations, poisonings. As you remember, the use of chemical weapons in the United Kingdom by Russian spies. They see our society's openness as a huge weakness and vulnerability. And so I do fear that there's going to be more sabotage attacks, more assassination attempts, more larger scale disruption attempts to try to disrupt the lives of ordinary people across Europe in order for Russia to spread fear and to try to get us to not think about defending ourselves as much and to give in to Russian desires. But it's having the opposite effect, and I think it'll continue to. But you're correct to point out, we are still very, very vulnerable across Europe, and those vulnerabilities aren't going to go away because we're not, I hope, going to change from being open societies.
And to what extent do you think President Trump is having a rethink about that rapprochement that looked so likely, let's say back in February, March? I mean, do you think he is now thinking, or perhaps is he being told by some of his advisors, not so fast?
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's not only his advisors, but also, Trump is so transactional, and he really wants to know what's in it for him and what's the deal that he can get. And honestly, Russia, other than oil resources, which the United States is seeking to supplant Russia as a major supplier globally, Russia doesn't have a lot. They're not a future economy. They don't have the rare earths that China has. They don't have the vibrant workforce that so many countries around the world has. They're not an emerging power. They're a descending power. And I think a lot of his advisors, watching Putin kind of run Russia's reputation into the ground, are saying, why would we hitch our wagon to this particular dying horse? Why don't we go with something more interesting? And quite frankly, the Europeans are doing a lot better and a lot more interesting things. The countries of the Middle East that Trump also has a huge affinity for, real rising middle powers there. And then in Asia as well, countries like South Korea and Japan. So you could see a transactional, in it for himself Trump, who ends up allying with traditional allies because there's just more of a future there.
And just lastly, I want to ask you something that sort of draws on your expertise at NATO. I mean, supposing there was one of these attacks that we were talking about, sabotage, a cyber attack on a massive scale, could that, do you think, something really advanced, trigger Article 5?
I think the Allies are very, very careful about Article 5. It's only been invoked once in NATO history, and it was actually on a 9/11, and the United States didn't really want an Article 5 declaration because it meant the whole alliance was at war. So I think we're going to be really careful about Article 5 in the future, but I do think you're going to see NATO allies signaling the real potential for deterrent actions against Russian hybrid operations. So if they do try something in terms of sabotage, that we might actually threaten something a little bit more violent, a little bit more decisive to try to deter Russia from doing that in the future. So we could be in a real dangerous place here if Putin believes that he can get away with these attacks. So I think you're going to hear more things like what we heard from the German general in future days, highlighting the Russian threat and emphasizing the need to respond decisively, even to things like sabotage and assassination in the future, whereas 5 years ago, allies might have been more willing to sweep that under the rug.
All right, we're going to leave it there. We're out of time, but really appreciate you sharing those insights with us. William Alberque, former director of NATO's Arms Control, Disarmament and Weapons of Mass Destruction Non-Proliferation Center. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, that brings you up to date with these developments. A strong focus today on Operation Spider's Web, analysis and perspective from the UK, former NATO officials there for you in this edition. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Do stay with us here on Arabiya English.